Great work that you've done. So I want to share a little bit about your background. So a professor at Emerita.
I'm a professor emerita,
Emerita.
which means that I retired, but I can use the name of the university for the rest of my life because they granted me what would be for a man emeritus and for a woman emerita status.
Okay.
But that's given separately after you retire if they feel you should be awarded some association with the university for the rest of your life. Obviously, it's a decision made by some group at the university that has decided that whatever you have published or would be publishing is going to be worth having the university's name associated with.
Okay. In the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas. And you held the 21st Century Chair in Teacher Quality.
Right. The chairs were separate from the actual position of professorship, but that's a detail that relates to state legislature and rules and procedures and could vary from state to state. But I had a chair which was separately endowed, and that's something people sometimes are interested in because the Walton family is one of the important families in Arkansas higher education because they wanted to increase the visibility of their efforts, let me put it that way. They knew their sister Alice was building this museum called Crystal Bridges in Bentonville, which is not too far, but it's in northwest Arkansas. And the university's flagship campus, which was the one I was at, was in Fayetteville, which is also part of northwest Arkansas in the Ozarks.
Oh, wow.
People have very old ideas about who is in the Ozarks.
Yeah, there's a new TV show about the Ozarks right now.
Well, I learned that the French had named a lot of those places when they came down the Mississippi trading and were establishing Indian posts for fur, trading of furs back in the 17th, 18th century. And so northwest Arkansas, which was where the Ozarks were, some are a little bit in Missouri because we're close to the borderline of Missouri, were where you had a lot of Scots-Irish immigrants from Scotland who had gone to Northern Ireland, and then because of the ethnic cleansing that took place there, some of them came to Canada, others came to the Ozarks, Smoky Mountains.
Interesting. And so you've done all kinds of research from teacher licensure testing. You have
some in that area too.
Right, a lot of that in that area.
Local schools.
You've done stuff in literature and reading curriculum, academic achievement in single-sex classrooms. You've critiqued on Common Core standards in the English arts and mathematics, U.S. history, civic engagement, and aspects of the Common Core project. I mean, I can go on and on and on. You've written books. You're an advocate of standards-based reform and strong academic standards and assessments for students and teachers. And today I wanted to share much of your research, and you are a legend when it comes to just teaching and making sure that teachers are meeting their standards, right?
Right. It was making sure that they were academically qualified to teach to the higher standards for kids in K-12 in major subjects. And what we achieved, or what I was able to achieve through the standards, which the teachers in Massachusetts had a great deal of input in because I would bring them in by grade levels to give us advice. I would call on academic experts in math, English, science, other areas, and they would give me their advice on content, subject matter content. And then the teachers would come in and give advice on where to place the content for appropriate teaching, because that was what they needed to be sure about for K-12. So I was constantly meeting teachers at different levels and having experts from all over the country in every area possible who were delighted to be able to give advice on what the content in these disciplines should be, because I wasn't vetting what they told me, they were vetting what they told me.
And this is so important because you only have so many hours in the day. So you want to maximize that time with the students, with the children. And this is very important. You were also a big implementer of MIRA. You have also,
It was all done under the Massachusetts Ed Reform Act of '93. And that was brought about and written by 3 significant politically active people at the time. Governor Weld, the governor at the time, that MIRA mostly was being written, and Mark Roosevelt, who was in the House of Representatives in Massachusetts, because mainly the focus was on state money for a foundation formula, as they called it, that would give all school systems in the state more money. And then Tom Birmingham, who was Senate President. And the 3 men, who all were graduates of Harvard Law School, so they could all speak the same language and they could understand each other, wrote probably one of the best pieces of legislation. I was, in a sense, the administrator of MIRA, M-E-R-A, in the Department of Education, because their main concern, as Tom Birmingham told me years later, was to improve teacher academic quality. They saw the business people in the state were behind MIRA. That was why it got through the state legislature, which wasn't generally happy about increasing or giving tax money to schools for more to do with education. People in the state legislature were not terribly happy with our schools of education. Kids had been doing less well before 1993, according to them, during the 70s and 80s. And businesses, the big banks and other institutions in Massachusetts were spending a huge amount of money for in-house classrooms. They would hire people who had been educators or knew something about what the school curriculum should be. And they were spending money training their workers for what they thought the public schools should be doing to begin with. So they were, and Jack Rennie is the businessman who died of a heart attack before I ever had a chance to meet him, but his name is often referred to by people who had something to do with M-E-R-A, MIRA, because he was able to reach a number of the CEOs who were in charge of the big banks or other institutions, financial institutions in the Boston area, and make sure that there would be support for what would be called the foundation formula, which was to pull up students who were low achievers if they could, and to improve philosophically everybody. That was the major thrust, and I mention that because it turns out this was almost the opposite of what Common Core was about. And we didn't realize what a gold mine we had in this wonderful bill that was, as I told Tom Birmingham, the best piece of progressive legislation I had ever encountered, and I was in charge of implementing it because the philosophy was to improve everybody. It wasn't just to improve the bottom, and it wasn't just to improve the top students. It was to improve everybody. So we were trying to raise scores for the whole group of people who would be employed as high school graduates or more in this state. And we were, and it worked. I mean, Massachusetts became the first state to reach the top with its students after we got our standards in place and implemented. But we had students who are now hitting the top in grade 4 and grade 8 in English and in math, both, was the only state that ever accomplished that.
Wow, what an accomplishment. And,
And then science, we tied with Singapore.
right, wow.
That was an international test, and we were doing even better on an international test over which we had no control, so no one could ever accuse us of in any way manipulating
Right.
the test.
You were also on part of the validation of Common Core.
That was when Common Core came down the pike, which was in 09 and 10.
And you were part of the fight to reclaim control of education by local districts.
Yes, because that was part of the problem that I saw with Common Core, that it was taking away the local control of curriculum that had made a huge amount of difference to how local school systems would address whatever they saw as their needs, because they were on top of, just as we now have with police departments and other agencies that serve at the local level and are usually paid for out of local taxes.
Yeah, everything comes down to standards, testing, maintaining high quality and excellence in every industry. I think that is a mark of what all your life efforts are towards.
We were trying to raise up the education system because it underlies everything else. The employment situation and the colleges students go on to if they do. And not everybody necessarily wants to go to a college. We also had a very flourishing and very high level vocational education system, regional high schools in this state. And those were important. I advised on the licensing test because it was a separate system for the coursework, the shops, which were not under, that they were not academic, so they wouldn't have been under my charge.
And so tell me, what inspired you to become a teacher?
To begin with, I became a teacher because I had been inspired. I grew up in Bridgewater, a very small town south of Brockton, and my model was my Latin teacher and my plane geometry teacher, the same person, but in a small town high school. And I don't know what size high school you went to, but in a small town high school, teachers often taught more than one major subject. We couldn't even afford one full-time math teacher in the high school that I went to. So different people picked up different pieces, and the Latin teacher, who was wonderful, she'd been there for like 35 years, since World War I. And she was my model for the 4 years of Latin that I took in high school, and taught everybody in the high school plane geometry in the 10th grade, because that was when the school would use its old textbooks that went back for many years, because you could look in the front of the book and see the stamp on it that would tell you how far back I mean, this is typical of New England. You had people who bought textbooks back in the 20s and 30s, and students were still using the same textbooks 20 years later because they didn't change textbooks in major subjects. History was the only subject that you would have current events to add, and we were using the best that the town could buy, the U.S. history textbook by David Muzzy, and historians would remember him because his textbook was, for several generations, the history textbook used by most students in this entire country. And it only went up to World War II. So anything that happened after World War II, you had to make sure that you had other material available. But I was modeling my interest in education on a teacher who, to me, was one of the best teachers, because towns in those days for high school could hire whoever they wanted. That was one of the things I later learned, that while teacher licensing in New England for the high school years took place in the 60s and 70s, before then, schools could hire for high school teaching anyone they thought was qualified. We had loads of liberal arts colleges, and was very unusual, and it was one of the reasons you had these outstanding people teaching in high school, because they didn't have to go to an ed school and get a degree in an ed school in order to teach. They could be a graduate in Greek and Latin at a liberal arts college, and if the town thought they could work well and they had teacher evaluations, population was smaller, then they could hire and rehire. And of course salaries were low, and they didn't have unions in those days either. So towns had a superintendent who pretty much could do whatever the superintendent wanted to do if they were looking for quality. And when I got married and had 5 children and moved to Brookline, one of the major reasons I moved to Brookline was because it was known for its excellent school system. So I knew that my 5 children would have a good K-12 education, regardless of which elementary school they went to. And that was what I wanted to be assured of.
And that's what's common today. Everyone wants to move into that town that they feel their children in the public school system are getting the best education possible.
Right.
Right?
And those kinds of standards were developed in later years because there were great fears that one of the reasons we had a growing number of low achievers in later years was because the teachers weren't as qualified for high school as earlier ones. I was, of course, still trying to beef up elementary teaching because all kids go to elementary school, no matter where they live. But you have to have certain coursework to make sure. And I grew up in the town that had a state teachers college founded by Horace Mann, who was known from the 19th century as one of the major national educators in the country. He set up state boards of education, and Massachusetts was the first state, I believe, to have compulsory education as part of a state requirement, so that children who came from immigrant families would have to go to school. You then had these compulsory education laws, child labor laws, later on, because I looked into a lot of that on my own just to find out the background to what I was doing. And Massachusetts was always considered one of the most educated, if not the state with the highest degree of education, the number of college graduates, number of private colleges, small colleges, didn't matter what they were, but they could be bigger schools, smaller schools, but it was the education of people, particularly immigrants, because it was one of the major states for immigrants coming from Europe.
And we still want to believe that today.
Yes.
In 2020. And so why do you feel, or tell me a little bit about how important scholarly and civic values are imparted into students today by
Very
our
important.
by our taxpayers' money?
Very important, because I was the recipient of those from my high school history teacher. Now, one of the things that made New England unique was something called town meeting, which was the form of government we have in New England. It was spread in different ways by people from New England who then moved out west, particularly after the Civil War. But remember, abolitionism was centered in Massachusetts in particular, around the Boston, New Bedford area, where you had ministers and others who were very concerned about the issue of slavery, although what Lincoln was doing was mainly protecting local government and the Union. And we had people who would talk on preserving the Union, because how else were you going to attract all those young men from New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine to take part in the Civil War? Slavery had been banished, from before the country was even organized as a United States of America, and before Washington became the first president. So you had a lot of young men who needed to feel that they had a cause, and the cause was the preservation of the Union. That was the important thing for them. And Massachusetts was one of the 13 original colonies and had so many of the important leaders to begin with. But freedom, liberty were important issues for the people who were seen as leaders. And John Adams, of course, who wrote our state constitution, came from Massachusetts. And David McCullough, bless his soul, wrote the book about the letters between him and Abigail, his wife, and they lived near Quincy. And this was part of the background. So we had not only state history, local history, but national history all taking place here in Massachusetts, including the famous ports. You lived, I know, near Newburyport, which was one of the major ports, and Salem and Boston, and of course there were several other major ports up and down the eastern seacoast. And after the clipper ships, and seafaring was a major way that people made a living in this particular area, if they lived along the Atlantic coastline or near the islands near New Bedford.
So you've done a lot of research on storytelling and epics. Can you explain how that is so important?
That was because of my interest in children's literature. I wasn't so much an expert in storytelling as I relied upon people who came with immigrant groups. And I was told when I was teaching 2 courses at Harvard, Graduate School of Education, in children's literature, that Irish storytellers were among the best, because Ireland for many years had been semi-literate or not a high level of literacy, and they had had storytellers, one of whom was at the South Boston branch of the public library, and she was recommended to me. So I made sure that we had exposure to storytelling, because every country which had peasants or serfs or whatever before the 19th century, public school systems weren't developed until late into those centuries in most countries. America had one of the highest rates of literacy until the 20th century. Until what happened after World War II was unusual, which was why we developed in this country, in this state, MIRA, to increase the literacy level back to what we had had. But we had always had very demanding implicit standards from the teachers we hired, because we were among the last states to ever require licensing. As I mentioned earlier, high school principals could hire whoever they wanted from our many liberal arts colleges in this state, and they didn't need to have education coursework or education degrees. The earlier years, yes, that had been one of Horace Mann's great accomplishments. He had made sure and set up these state colleges for women, young women typically, who would teach in the elementary grades. And I can still remember the ones. They were always a Miss something, because there was the notion that once a woman married, she was going to get married and have children. So you would lose that teacher, and you wanted to have someone who was going to be around for a while. My first grade teacher, her name was Miss Grace Smith, had taught for about 30 years first grade. She was a wonderful teacher, but the town knew it could depend upon her being there from year to year. But once a teacher got married, and this was true in Boston, and they used to talk about the fact that they didn't hire married women, and that's true, but they would dismiss a married woman once she got married. Goodbye. It seems quaint today.
Oh, that's good. That's funny. So, when did you become aware that the School of Education was not promoting excellence?
when I was in the Department of Education, and it mainly started over the reading issue, which was of course my area of expertise, because I had been one of Jean Shaw's students at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and she was known throughout the country, in fact throughout the world, for being an expert on beginning reading research. And here I was now in a position to wonder, along with people from our education schools in this state, why Massachusetts, like other states, was having a lot of problem with kids in the early grades, in the primary grades, learning how to read. Were they not being taught any systematic phonics at all? Were they not being taught vocabulary, which was my basic interest? I was not particularly interested in either phonics or the other issues, blended vowels and consonants or other things that beginning teachers do. I was interested in the developing vocabulary knowledge that good readers, because I had always been a good reader, but I wanted to see what we knew about vocabulary and how we could make sure that the vocabulary knowledge was there. And this fit into civic values. That was an earlier question of yours, because I had a history teacher, as I mentioned, who was in town meeting. He was the moderator of town meeting in Massachusetts, in Bridgewater, where I grew up. And he would tell us after town meeting in the spring what happened at town meeting the night before. And I became very interested in this notion of self-government, because this was, to me, the ultimate civic engagement. If people knew how to run their own affairs, if they could manage their own property tax money, because that was the requirement for being a town incorporated into the Commonwealth's Massachusetts Bay Colony, whatever it was called, until the country was founded, then you could have a better sense of civic virtue develop when people had to decide for themselves what they wanted their own tax money based on. And basically, this started, I lived in Brookline for many years, but Brookline was incorporated sometime around 1700. I lived in a town, Bridgewater, that was incorporated in 1656, but it was part of Plymouth County, so it must have had maybe some of the Pilgrim people who came over on the Mayflower. We wouldn't know, because we never did any research into the background of the important families that lived in Bridgewater. It was a small town by the time I grew up in it, with one of the first state prisons, as well as one of the first state colleges, both ends.
Wow.
It had a psychiatrist at the state prison, which was an opening. This was the first time. This was for humane treatment of people with mental problems. Today, we wouldn't even do that. The idea today is more to let them out into small residential area, homes or whatever. But you had the civic knowledge that depended on the vocabulary level of the major terms that were used by people who founded this country. I did work in Eastern Europe, which you may have mentioned earlier, or I think is somewhere, where I went on a civic initiative to Eastern Europe. This was after the Berlin Wall fell, and they had gotten rid of their Marxist-Leninist coursework in K-12, which the Russians had wanted installed in their public schools, and they wanted democratic citizenship, whatever that consisted of, in their schools for K-12, because they didn't want any more Marxist-Leninist. They had had enough of it. We were there as part of the Free Polish Government solidarity that came in after the Berlin Wall had fallen and all of these satellite or other countries in Eastern Europe broke away and decided they wanted to establish their own schools or school systems for their own children as they saw fit. And so they had words to worry about, and I remember one of them being constituent in Poland. There was no word for constituent. It meant so much in a democracy. How could you not have a word for it in Polish? It didn't exist. They would have to create a word that meant constituent. English had it, but England was the country we were modeled on in many respects. But it, of course, meant that this was someone who had geographical representation. This might be of interest to you historically, that here were these countries that had been under central planning and under a central government that had decided who in Warsaw would represent Lublin. And now they wanted someone from Lublin to represent Lublin. So how are they, or someone from Krakow to represent Krakow. And the constituents would be the people who lived in Lublin or Krakow. And so we had to figure out with people who were social studies teachers in Poland, what were some of the key words that they needed to figure out the equivalence of, because they didn't even exist as words, as concepts, which was something we had never thought about. And constituents I remembered because it was so important for elections. I mean, I'm sure you've used that.
Yes, that's all I'm saying right now is, I represent all the constituents in my district, and if you're going to another country, another culture, you're educating them on this. It's a whole new system, and so of course a new word must be created.
Right.
And
it was a concept
right.
that has to be there. You're representing people and the people who are chosen or elected live in those areas and know many of the people there. That's what having constituents means. And we were told in education this was vital. They wanted, one of the things, the people that we were interacting with, who were, I would call, the intellectual wing of the Solidarity Party, because they were mainly professors of philosophy or psychology in Poland, they wanted to make sure that the principals of the schools in each town or city in Poland were not chosen by a central committee in Warsaw, but were chosen by the people who lived in that town or city, so that they would have some contacts with local parents and others. That was what was important. That was where they saw local control in the schools coming from, not from a central government, even though they did like the idea that all students would have the same standards. I mean, there were certain things that you did for countries with smaller populations in the United States. But since we developed in such a fragmented way, it was going to be a very different kind of situation here.
And I also think that there are standards, but then you can exceed the standards, and you can continue to, wherever you set that standard is going to be where people will work hard to get to a certain level. If you increase that standard, then the people will need to work harder.
Right.
So I think it's really important that where you set that standard, because I always say, you want to set your standards high, because it gives you something to work for. And then once you reach that standard,
right,
push yourself even farther. Challenge yourself.
And that's what we tried to do on the basis of mirror. And that was something Tom Birmingham was very particularly interested in. He was one of the three writers of Mirror, as I mentioned earlier. And he was very interested in how we beefed up teachers. They had to know their subjects so that you could know in math, that you could extend high school math to a course in trigonometry or analysis or whatever you needed at the advanced level, to raise standards for those who needed them for going on in engineering or another area.
It's just like sewing. I know a lot of ladies, my mom sewed, her sister sewed, they all learned how to sew. So there's a certain level of threading that needle, right? And maybe fixing a hem. But then you can get to an advanced level of sewing where you're on the machine, you're really doing some complex work. And if you don't use those skills, you lose them. right? So I always talk about perishable skills. And as you look at the education system, you want to build a foundation that the kids, as they grow into adults, they grow upon that skill set. They don't lose it. And I think that is important.
And
so I have
that's
a
what
question.
people learned, that you had to reinforce these skills with harder content.
That's right.
As kids moved up the grades. And once you began diminishing the content, then you diminish the level of the skill they're going to acquire.
And they're not thinking. I'm always talking about being critical thinkers. So I have a question on you on abandoning the park. Is that good or bad, and why?
Oh, park versus PARCC.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about, the testing, which used someone from the Massachusetts Department of Education. We lost so many good people. Jeff Nelhouse was in charge of assessment at the Department of Ed, and then was hired to become the director of assessment for PARCC, one of the two assessment consortia. I'm trying to remember the words that were used for Common Core after Common Core was developed. And he knew how we had drawn from English teachers in the state, because we had some of the most demanding English teachers, as you can imagine, in our high schools, since they had been English majors in our liberal arts colleges before they were hired in the days when English teachers were hired straight out, or in any foreign language. French and Spanish were always among the most popular foreign languages. Latin was separate because you didn't speak it typically. But you could hire these people straight out of their colleges and have them teach. And so you could do that with English, French, and Spanish, and make sure that demanding readings were there in the upper grades. Now, the question of why Park didn't work out, because Park, like SBAC, which was the other consortium based on Common Core, they were both based on Common Core, and so they were based on a lower level model. And if your tests, as they are by law, and I made sure that I had learned that thoroughly, that whatever standards you have in a state, they must be the basis for whatever tests you develop in a state. In other words, you cannot have a test coming into a state or used by a state or adopted by a state if it was developed elsewhere, because every state uses some version of Common Core's standards. And Park was one of the two support consortia, testing consortia, that was sponsored with money by USED, the Department of Education in Washington. And so you had students being tested with lower level test items based on lower level standards. It's not surprising that we now have widening gaps and lower level average scores on NAEP, National Assessment for Educational Progress, which is a separate testing system sponsored by the federal government that Congress established around 1970, when it saw the first signs of this diminishing of student achievement.
And when we saw this decline of student achievement, who do you think, or who was influencing the schools? What do you see back then as?
By that time, in most states, your teacher unions and your schools of education were probably the major influences on whatever was taking place in the school. You might have some people denying that they ever had that kind of influence, but schools were always looking to see what their neighbors were doing. It's common to find out what your neighboring towns and cities are doing. Or you had systems like NAEP that had been set up for college admission purposes to show what colleges students were going to. So there were ways to compare. It wasn't on the same test necessarily from state to state, because Congress had purposely, back in '68 when it first passed this legislation, they were concerned about having the federal government having too much control, which is exactly our problem today. We have a form of central planning that means we have little experimentation taking place that really is experimentation. And when we had ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, in December 15 under President Obama, that was one of the last things, major acts that he signed, you have very little difference from state to state because they've been trying, in the name of equity, as they call it, to get rid of differences. And this is not only differences from state to state, it's differences from community to community and from groups of students to other groups of students. That was where the notion of gaps came from, that you wanted to reduce by labeling students as coming from a particular race, except they weren't all races, but you called white students all white, even though some were Italian, some were Spanish, some were German, French, whatever. They came from different ethnic groups, but the whole system was distorted by people who wanted to figure out how refugees coming from Central and South America could get to the same level as those other students who are already here in Massachusetts or in other communities that had had for generations higher levels of education wherever they lived. And in Massachusetts, this was one of the things, as I say, that was known. Even in the South had a much less developed public education system than Massachusetts, New Jersey, and other communities in the North, which were known for having stronger math and science departments. And then, of course, we had all those private schools, the boarding schools, the same, what was called facetiously the St. Grottlesex complex, because you had a system of boarding schools throughout New England, which was where students who came from families that could afford to send them, and then they would go to the Ivy Leagues or other prestigious colleges. And here you had generation after generation of highly educated homes producing more highly educated children. And somehow that seemed unfair to children who were new to this cycle of families, particularly if they came from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, wherever, that had a very underdeveloped public school system until the late 19th century, which was when many of these countries began to first develop their public education systems. But we were far ahead at that time of these other countries, and many of these immigrants who came in the late 90s, the huge wave that came at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century until World War I, came from countries with very underdeveloped public school systems. So you had the schools trying to figure out how to combine children from highly educated families with children, immigrant children, who maybe didn't even know English when they came. As I discovered from speaking to older relatives of mine, what did they do when they came? And they were in Brockton area, and I remember speaking to an aunt who told me, no one in my first grade class knew English except the teacher and the principal. All the rest of us spoke different languages. And I said, well, how did you learn English? She said, we learned by playing on the playground with each other. The playground games were the way they learned English. Teachers didn't know what to do. But if they told the girls to go play jump rope and the boys wanted to play boys' games at that time, then they had to learn one language so they could call the signals in one language. And that was how they learned. He said by the end of first grade, we were all speaking English.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, we have to communicate on one level. or, you know, one language. We all have to, how can a group of people that's a blend from all over the place, you have to have one universal language. I would think that is what makes a society
If you want to play a game with a skip rope game, you've got to have the same rhymes in English.
And the kids seem to figure it out.
They learn
That's
fast,
right.
right
They
away.
learn how, they know how to communicate.
Young kids learned
right.
a second language or a
Like
third
that.
language.
Exactly.
It didn't affect what they, because my aunts and uncles all spoke the home language in their home. I had grandparents who never learned English, 40 years in this country, and they never learned English. They didn't need it because they were always in the kitchen.
But this goes back to, you know, increasing the standards. Many of us can learn multiple languages, and, you know, it's that brain mapping that goes on from a very young age, and we you know,
And
need to
they
encourage
learned it when they went to junior high or middle schools. And as long as they had instruction in that language, that was how they could learn the language. That became, I mean, I went through the bilingual wars at the Department of Ed as well. I mean, I went through wars in every subject.
You're a warrior.
I was getting wounded from every war I was in because it was very clear that no one was going to learn English well unless they were required to learn English.
That's
and the teacher was going to make sure that they were given more and more difficult books to read as they went up the grades, which was part of the secret of the standards that you had to have. It wasn't just student interest. Yes, you wanted students to be interested in what they were reading, but they had to be assigned harder and harder vocabulary.
That's right. I was going to just say, it goes back to the vocabulary.
And that was where my vocabulary interest came up. How are we going to get kids to learn the vocabulary of a Jane Austen novel if they weren't able to even read close to a Jane Austen novel, or to read Mark Twain, or the wonderful humorists that we had in this country? I mean, we were blessed to have major writers who had been humorous, but no one could read them at the high school level anymore if they couldn't read the big words that some of them used.
Exactly.
So we had a lot of problems to sort out, but the English teachers helped to guide what they had had because they had come from good liberal arts colleges. We had had English majors.
So tell me, how would you amend MCAS, where teachers teach?
Where teachers teach. First of all, you've got to strengthen the teachers. If you want to strengthen students and raise standards, you start with teachers. And that was the opposite of what Common Core did. Common Core started with students. And I never could understand, how do you raise standards if students can't be taught by teachers who know more math, who know science? They're not going to learn that much from projects. They call it project-based learning, if they don't know the foundations, as you mentioned earlier. So you've got to have certain things taught in the elementary school, which was the basis for that, particularly reading and arithmetic, because I had taught all of that. I had become first an elementary teacher in grade 3, and I understood what it meant to have teachers who could impart the foundations for every subject in the elementary school. And it wasn't just math and English. You had to do the spelling as well. That would be the English. But you had to have kids learning how to spell. How were they going to do writing if they didn't read a lot of English? Because that was an area I did a lot of research in, because there were people who weren't happy to see, and MCAS needs to reflect. If you want a lot of good writing from kids, they've got to be doing a lot of good reading in that language. Doesn't matter what language you're teaching. You don't become a good writer of French if you don't read a lot of French. I became a French major because I read a lot of French literature when I went to high school. We had a teacher who came from Pembroke College, which was part of Brown University at that time. But we had to read major works of literature in high school in French. And from that, I then, and anyone who's taken advanced French courses know that that's where you learn case endings or agreement. You've got to see this happening in And in English, you've got to see what a complete sentence looks like. You're not going to learn from conversation what a complete sentence is, because no one speaks in complete sentences.
Another question I have here, what made pre-Common Core standards better?
Because we had a lot of reading that was required. And that was part of the secret. That's a good segue after what I was saying before. I had done enough work in Jean Shaw's reading department to know that roughly 2/3 of what kids should be doing was reading, and writing would be 1/3. You didn't really do much with writing until high school. The essay was taught in grade 9. But elementary school was mainly reading. I remember I was told when I started teaching, which was in the early 50s, first hour was always arithmetic when kids were fresh. If you didn't capture them for arithmetic from 9 to 10, they would never learn arithmetic. I mean, there were some things older teachers could teach you. And then from after 10 until 12 o'clock, until lunchtime, that was reading, some form of reading. But you had to spend a lot of time on reading at whatever level of interest, because there you're dealing with kids' interests too. I mean, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. So you've got to you try to have readings that are of interest to boys in particular, who'd rather be jumping up and around and doing other things, as most teachers know. And that was why I was interested in single-sex education in Arkansas, because they were trying to find out what would interest boys who were typically interested in taking care of the roosters, the rabbits, or the horses on their farms. And if you wanted them to become readers, what did you have to give them as reading material to get them to sit and read a book? The girls were more apt to be interested in sitting and reading and doing school games.
I wasn't. I was the tomboy, but that is very, very interesting.
But older teachers knew that, because they could tell. You know, there was one 5th grade teacher who said, every hour I get all the kids up, we open up the windows, and I have them march around the classroom.
That's good.
Because the boys needed the exercise. Little girls didn't need it as much. Not that they wouldn't benefit from exercise, but the boys absolutely needed that. They were antsy already. She could tell, because she'd been teaching for a number of years. And this was Arkansas, where kids were very friendly with the outdoors because the weather allowed them.
So tell me, what do you think the benefits are to going back to paper and pencil?
And that's where the testing would be better off, because computer-based testing, which is what Common Core introduced and led to, meant that little kids starting from kindergarten would have to sit in front of a computer to learn how to drop or do what all these little signals and motions are. And it takes a longer time. I mean, there's the question of benefits versus cost, but we're not talking about money. We're really talking about time and energy. And so you want to have kids, that's why they don't begin ballet. I'm switching subjects deliberately, but ballet training begins at about 8, 9, or 10, because you want to see what the developing child is going to have in terms of long legs or whatever. You've got to wait to make sure that you're not committing a lot of time to learning something that will be learned in a much shorter time later on. And music, unless you have a gifted prodigy, you don't start lessons with 2 or 3-year-olds. You wait until they can do something and they're more amenable to rational discourse. I mean, it's very individualized, and teachers know that. And if you have musician parents, so you can start earlier because the child is used to hearing what a violin sounds like or something like that. But you've got to be able to, with writing and reading, you start with reading because that's what kids can do a lot of when they're young. It's very few who are going to be gifted writers. Wait till they're older and they've seen enough reading, good reading. But Common Core wanted to start writing right away. So it had almost the same number of reading standards, and I used to say, when I was speaking to teachers, I would say, what do you spend most of your time on in your classes? Reading. Because any old teacher knew that you had to spend more time on the reading of a subject. You may not pick up everything, the content, but your eyes are constantly going in the right direction when you're reading, and you're seeing what the printed word looks like, what the spelling looks like. I mean, where is spelling going to come from? You don't individually learn every single word in the English language.
I want to talk about competencies and how important this is, and how competencies have been lowered in certain grades.
Skills.
Yes.
By competencies, this is more recent, because the idea, I think, unfortunately, was that if you turned standards into competency skills, in other words, diminished the content of what you were trying to teach and increased the skill level, that you would get higher academic levels. Doesn't work that way. Little kids need content, and it may not matter that much what the content is, so long as it's content. It feeds into critical thinking. You can't think in a vacuum. You've got to have something to think with in your head in order to do critical thinking about anything. What is missing? How do you know what's missing if you haven't read enough to know that there is something else that might be added? So you have this problem of making sure that you're requiring enough reading and giving kids access to the reading skills, because in the beginning those are skills. There's no content to the phonics or even to the beginning sight word vocabulary that kids do need a little bit of, because how do you learn who, what, where, those terrible words that are everywhere in beginning reading? They're not phonically regular, most of them. So you've got to have some sight word training. I remember helping my own children with some sight words, but you want to get enough regular material, regular spelling regularities, so that they can become fluent with whatever they're doing. But that's part of, now this was connected to competencies. So the idea was that if you lowered the level of the content required and turned the content more into a skill, you would be fine. But I was an amateur pianist, and I took piano lessons because my aunt taught me piano. She was a pianist herself and a piano teacher in the town I grew up in. So I learned that you wanted to be able to have students who could acquire these skills, but the skills would depend upon the content that went with them. You couldn't read a Jane Austen novel with first grade skills. You could read a Dr. Seuss book, Green Eggs and Ham, with first grade skills, because he purposely wrote for first graders. But the words are small.
But what are we seeing now with the current level of education and competencies at grade 10? You have some insight into that.
Okay.
What are you seeing?
I asked English teachers, what should we have in grade 9 and 10 specifically, because I wanted their advice on when a kid went from junior high or middle school to a high school in Massachusetts, what did they want to see the kid be able to read? And the English teachers said epic poetry, and I thought, oh my God, what is epic poetry? Well, it meant either the Iliad, the Odyssey, or the Aeneid. That was what they meant by epic poetry. It was a translation of the work of Homer, or Latin. And that was what they wanted all kids to be able to read. So we had a standard for 9 or 10. We left it up to the teachers, but they basically wrote the standard. Tell us the theme, the major characters, or the plot. which would be close to the theme, except the theme is typically used for fiction, for literature. And tell us in your own words what the kids of some epic poem from ancient Greece and Rome. They made it that specific because they wanted to give everyone, by the time they were in high school, a similar background. That isn't anymore part of Common Core. They're not giving kids similar backgrounds. American literature was usually grade 11, so that kids would have a sense of some similarities. Now, I don't know how many of you ever read The Cremation of Sam McGee. I remembered the things that I had read when I was in grade 8 that I enjoyed, only it was grade 8. Or some of the Edgar Allan Poe short stories. He used an enormous vocabulary, but whatever he wrote, what was it, The Pit and the Pendulum? I'm trying to think of the titles. His famous short stories were usually in grade 8 because they were short stories. And they had enormous vocabulary in them, and that was, I'm sure, no teacher ever told us that, but they were trying to develop kids' vocabulary before they went into high school, because once they got into high school, then they would be expected to read mature novels. Now, in those days, it was considered almost contemporary to ask for a George Eliot novel. So we read Silas Marner. It was made fun of years later because this was considered old-fashioned. But at the time it was introduced into the school curriculum, it was actually fairly contemporary to the people who introduced it, because I think she wrote the novel somewhere in the 1880s or 1890s, something like that in English. But the point was that you've got to get competencies, skills based upon mature stuff for kids to read, so that by the time we read a Shakespeare play every year. Now, by the 4th year we read a Shakespeare play, we were already surmounting the problem of, what was the one in the 9th grade? The one with Shylock as the main character, Portia. I'm trying to remember the titles of them, because I had a Shakespeare play every year.
I didn't have a Shakespeare play every year.
The Merchant of Venice was 9th grade. Everywhere, every town that I knew of taught The Merchant of Venice in grade 9. In grade 10, that was Julius Caesar. Everyone read it everywhere. Julius Caesar. Grade 11 was either Hamlet or King Lear, and then the other one was senior year. So you had a struggle with high levels of poetry as well as vocabulary. And that was what they wanted to give everyone the same background for, so that you would raise everybody. If you just cater to students' interests, you're not going to get...
Right.
I mean, some kids are going to be green eggs and ham, even by high school, and other kids will be Hamlet. I mean, you want to get a little... You want to raise the bottom, and that was part of what Massachusetts did. It had people who came as Puritans from England who were already educated, and they came in 1630. People don't know that in 1635 they founded Boston Latin. 5 years after they landed, they founded the first boys' public high school. And 1636 was Harvard College. They wanted their own ministers and they wanted their own lawyers. And that was what you went to college for. But it was within 6 years after they landed here. People don't realize that they saw the need for an educated citizenry if you were going to have self-government.
This is so important. And so as we approach the end of the time here, I have one final question. It's kind of a little off, but it's kind of relevant to today. What do you think about this social justice warrior that they talk about? Are young kids today being
the people who are the victims, and I really mean the victims of it, are bright black students, or bright black Latino immigrants, because they're not getting a rich curriculum from this. I began to look at what was part of it, what was called the Afrocentric curriculum. This is years ago that it came in, because people have been concerned since LBJ's War on Poverty and the money that was set aside as part of the first federal legislation in, 1965. And then the Coleman report came out in 1966. The Moynihan report came out in 1965. But if you wanted kids to learn, you had to be able to teach them. And I used as my model the old Dunbar High School, which was in Washington, D.C. It was a public high school, but those teachers scoured the city for the brightest black kids they could find to get them to enroll in Old Dunbar. It was named after a black poet in the 19th century. And the brightest black students we had went to that high school. They were fine. They had a solid education. Maybe it was a small percentage of all of the children who were either black or Latino or Hispanic, whatever word was desirable to use. But it was there. It was part of the public school system. It was destroyed under desegregation. It became a neighborhood school system, so it had to take only neighborhood kids. And the teachers who were there no longer could scour them to get them to enroll in that high school, where they knew they were going to get an exam type of high school curriculum. And that was what Boston had in, 1635. It was going to have because they weren't worried about whether they were catering to able students or doing something with remedial classes for kids who were having a difficulty learning to read. They just wanted everybody to do better, and you had to do whatever you needed to do, and they spent the money, because first thing that was spent by Common Core, and earlier with Title I, the LBJ, what was called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, that was under LBJ in 1965. First thing was money spent on remedial reading and arithmetic. Remedial reading had mainly boys, as anyone could have predicted, and remedial arithmetic had mainly girls, because that was how it, those days, that's how it bounced out or fell out.
Interesting.
But the competencies were lowered by lowering the content. You only can elevate your skills by elevating the content. And that was why textbooks were needed. And towns, as kids went along up the grades, had to buy textbooks, or cities had to buy textbooks. Now, that's a major expense. So the textbooks introduced a level of homogeneity, sameness, similarity, because publishing companies of which were trying to combine and reach bigger audiences. Textbooks were expensive, and so they were trying to and this is what Common Core has done. It wants to have the same thing taught to everybody, as if that would close gaps.
Right.
But it doesn't, because you've got differences within. And I remember asking principals in Arkansas, what do you do if you have some kids who are reading much more advanced than others because of whatever? They have a drive to read, or they have parents who teach them to read, or whatever the reason is. You have better readers and slower readers. What are you going to do? And the principal said, according to Common Core, the better readers are just going to be on their own and read whatever they want on their own.
And then they get bored, and then they get in trouble and stuff like that.
It doesn't work out.
Right. No,
it doesn't work
right.
out. So the older idea that you had a set curriculum and moved kids along, moved them along, and then helped them with the vocabulary, which would be needed for more difficult works once you moved kids up that level. Okay,
Well, thank you so much for this interview, and we definitely need to have another one because we have much more to cover. Well, thank you so much.
Well, I'm happy to speak to parents and teachers. I have been in states where teachers were banned from listening to me. I was told by a union rep in Illinois that it would be in their personnel folder if they went to hear Dr. Stotsky.
Wow.
So I had only the union rep in one place. It was near Morton, Illinois. I'd never been there before. But the union rep came to tell me why there were no teachers in the audience. The people who organized the meeting had invited all the teaching staff, hoping there would be teachers there. And no teachers came.
Interesting. So, okay. Well, we are...